Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Natasha Janak, and I am the chairwoman of GUIDE, and we are part of the Mental Health Task Force, which is part of the Haitian Coalition of South Florida. We have with us tonight, this evening, we have a great guest by the name of Alex Lizzappi,
Yes.
and he is with Haiti now, and he is going to share with us a great topic on domestic servitude, extreme poverty, and geopolitics during COVID-19. Alex, can you tell us a little more about yourself?
Sure. So again, my name is Alex Lizzappi. I've been working with Ayiti now for 10 years. During the 10 years, chiefly, we have been focusing on children in domestic servitude. And when I saw last week your first video, I was very moved and I really wanted to participate and share some of our thoughts and our experience on this issue. I did enjoy a lot the angle of addressing this issue as human rights, but I wanted to shift a little bit the attention towards where the human rights violation starts from. And often I have seen we look at human rights at the surface level of the abuse and how these children are affected by the violence and the abuse that they are subjected to. But increasingly, during the 10 years, I have been asking, why these children end up in domestic servitude and the families get involved with these children. And then it's when overall I started to see the issues from multiple points of view. Something that I discovered is that as we are considering mental health for these children, I realized that also the very, so to speak, abusers, or so to speak, the people, the adults in the household would really benefit from mental health interventions. The language that is being used, or the current narrative that prevails about addressing this issue is typically is using slavery or modern day slavery, I think is not appropriate to address this issue. So in my opinion, lots of children in Haiti experience working. I do agree that this child in domestic servitude is not only an issue of workload, but definitely is an issue of abuse. It's an issue of how, under which conditions they work, which are very different from the other children. We can agree that human rights in Haiti are a very large issue that affects most people. So I do not want to isolate this child from the larger picture, because the phenomenon itself is a result of all of the other problems that economically and socially Haiti is going through and has been going through. The first distinction, then, I think the current narrative by US organizations working in Haiti is not a phenomenon driven by bad actors that are abusive and necessarily enslaving children. In my opinion, there is no market, there is no business of trafficking children. But the language, the prevailing language, is a language that is indicating that there is trafficking of children and almost is equating the issue to a more formalized slavery, as we know with the Atlantic trade slave. And I think are two very distinct issues, and using language that can make those two issues similar is not helping. There are many ways to analyze the distinctions without a particular chronology or importance. I would say that during slavery, people were taken from Africa, but there were not people that were volunteering. There were not people that were seeking to be taken to the United States. In the Restavek phenomenon, we know that parents are reaching out to relatives or friends of relatives in the city, possibly to find accommodation for their children, because predominantly they are thinking about opportunity for school or proximity to institutions or trade or commerce, but opportunity for these children. The majority of the households that are receiving these children do not really have the capacity economically to accept these children and provide appropriate shelter, appropriate food, appropriate education. I think a lot of times these households are struggling themselves with sending their own children to school, which we know that the education is largely privatized. So if you do not pay tuition, you cannot go to school. And having an additional child is often perceived by them as a liability. And from their point of view, they are providing a benefit, even if there is an issue of abuse and there is an issue of servitude. Specifically in regards to education, what I have experienced is that so-called decent school, good schools, particularly Christians or Catholic schools, will not even accept this type of child, because typically by policy, a child that is older than 1 or 2 years above grade age will not be accepted. So we have experienced over and over a lot of difficulties with enrolling children in so to speak, good schools. They encounter a lot of isolation and a lot of marginalization beside what is happening inside their households. The living conditions often are reminiscent of slavery, but the reality is that this child every day is walking out for multiple reasons by themselves. They could leave if they wanted to, but the reality is that there is nowhere for them to go. This applies to social level, which opportunities they have to ask for help, applies to the judicial system, applies to institutions by the government that are in place to protect children, applies to organizations, local organizations, foreign organizations, but there is a major deficit and no one is really has the capacity to respond to a child that is domestic servitude coming to ask for help and take ownership of the issue. Because what we know is that it's extremely difficult for a child to reach out. If they reach out, it's extremely difficult for a child to go back in the same household. It will be punished. So unless there is the ability to provide 100% protection and 100% programs to help that child, there is no way that they will be reaching out. We have seen, for example, that boys and girls deal with this issue in different ways. Boys at 12, 13 are often deciding to be in the street and walk away from the abuse. Girls instead, unfortunately, stay until they are 17, 18 years old. It's happening because for girls it will be so much more difficult to be in the street. But this is to reinforce the idea that using the terminology of slavery can suggest that there are bad people enslaving children and we need to go free them. But I don't think there is an issue of freedom. The reason why I wanted to clarify slavery and freedom, it's because if we use this terminology within Haiti, that can have a contextual meaning that people know what is being referred to, but outside of Haiti, then the general population that doesn't really know what's going on in Haiti will end up thinking that the solution is just to go and free children, when in reality, we need to understand the poverty that is triggering the abuse and the migration. When we start to think about the poverty, then eventually we understand that terminology need to be changed. And it's true that every country at one point or another in history went through some form of domestic servitude. And to be honest, my own grandmother was born in a large family, and she was the oldest, and she was given to her grandparents. To say that, 80, 90 years ago, some similar phenomena were happening in Italy as well. Domestic servitude possibly happens in many different countries, but I think every country has its own peculiarities. And I dislike to see solutions that want to resolve the same issue across the globe with the same solution, when in reality the triggers are different. When we start focusing on Haiti and why it's happening in Haiti, then if we agree that is driven by poverty, extreme poverty, the big question becomes why there is extreme poverty. And when we start looking at why there is extreme poverty, then we realize there is a geopolitical issue. What I mean is that there are policies, there are foreign policies that are generating the poverty that ultimately is sending these children into domestic servitude. I am now stepping into this issue because as a charity organization, we can try our best as much as we want, but we will never be fast enough to offset the speed by which poverty is generated. I know that you guys are the expert in sociology and psychology. I'm going to touch into a particular point that is my personal belief, and I'm not trained on the issue. But in my opinion, Haiti is turning out to be one of the worst social engineering experiments. And as a reference, I want to use what the United States has done in Chile with the coup against Allende and the replacement of Allende with Pinochet, and how we as a US have experimented right-wing or extreme right-wing or liberalization policies in Chile ahead of actually implementing in the US. In Haiti, we do know that historically there are two major political ideology and forces that are playing against each other in Haiti. So one will be Venezuela and Cuba on one side, and on the other side would be capitalism with the US, France, Canada, European Union, Germany, Spain. And these two blocs are, in my opinion, influencing the internal democratic process to their advantage, and each one is pulling for their benefit. So, in my opinion, the whole issue related to the Petrocaribe has a lot to do with this conflict, in the sense that we know that the US was never supportive of the Venezuelan policies in Haiti to facilitate social expenditure or expenditure for social programs through the Petrocaribe money. Now, in the last few weeks, I've seen news of Toto Constant returning to Haiti. And anybody that has knowledge of who Toto Constant was will know what is the extent by which the US will enter Haiti and manipulate the political forces to continue to push for their own interest in having right-wing political parties in power. I hope people will have the opportunity to research and read, but to those that do not see the link, I just want to point out that if for any citizen in Haiti that would like to get a visa for the United States, it is not such an easy process. But obviously for Toto Constant, whenever it was time for him to take off, the United States provided him with open door, even though they were fully aware of the thousands of people that were tortured, killed, raped, burned, imprisoned, but they did not have a problem with providing protection to him. This is basically pointing out to the fact that there is a system, and that system linked to the fact that institutionalized racism does not stop at the border of the United States. So we are all fully aware of what's going on in the United States, and what's going on in the United States as a predominant system does not stop at the border and continues. And indeed, unfortunately, the mindset and the mentality has been the same for the longest time. The difference is that in the US, now there is a movement that actually the movement has been there since always, of pointing out and demanding equality, equity, justice. But outside of the US, the degree of accountability is close to zero. And they get away with everything that they want to do, and they do that. In practical terms, to me, what it means is that the policies are dehumanizing the very people that are going to affect, because they do not really design the policies as if they were to embed the same human value into a lot of the countries where the United States is basically exploiting labor and resources. The clear example to me is that hundreds of thousands of women today went to work in Haiti for 45 cents an hour. Specifically, Levi's CEO is collecting $1 million a month in salary. So that system is not a free market system. That system is enabled by the US Department and USAID that are preparing the ground in countries where they want to have the ability to exploit labor and resources. I mentioned Levi's, but obviously the list is very long of corporate interest in Haiti. And as much as all of these corporations have foundations and they have some grant-making activities, I think that the reality is just like the same relationship between the US State Department and USAID. So on one side, they have a marketing machine that is confusing us about the reality, and on the other side, they are just profiting. We all know that 80% of the consumption of rice in Haiti is rice that comes from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. And we know that the majority of that rice is produced, transported, and directly distributed by a cooperative of US companies. We know that that door was opened by Clinton, which negotiated a 2.5% rate duty tax on import with the Asian government. We know that Clinton has recognized that as a mistake, but here we are 20 years after, and Asian farmers are still unable to compete with American rice. So what I'm saying is that there are policies are very clear, and we collectively know when and how they are wrong, but there is not truly a political intention to change. So it's too easy to build wealth and to build the middle class or the upper middle class on the backs of Haitians or any other country, because there are many other countries which are client state of the United States. It's too easy to formulate these business deals and to formulate this leverage. And we, I think, increasingly need to ask for those policies to be addressed and changed. Otherwise, we will never be able to overcome that poverty. Haiti is a country that it doesn't matter how much you study and how much you read, you will always be scratching the surface. But in my opinion, anytime that political leaders try to change those dynamics and address these issues, the United States found ways to remove them. I am not necessarily saying that the United States should close the embassy and go home, but I think that the organizations working in Haiti that are US-based and the growing political Asian leadership in the United States should really put pressure in all of our legislators to look at the policies, the real policies that are affecting the country. And there are approximately $1.2 billion worth of clothing coming out of Haiti towards the United States. And this $1.2 billion, it's a cost, an Asian cost. It's not at the actual value of the merchandise. So meaning the value of the merchandise is much higher. But there is $1.2 billion that are moved from Haiti to the United States in a very damaging way for Haiti, meaning the cotton gets into the DR, into free trade zones, and there the fabric is made, the textiles are made, then it's moved into Haiti without paying any tax, and then it's going into free trade zones where people are paid 45 cents an hour, and the ownership does not pay tax on their profits to the state of Haiti, and the final product is exported tax-free from Haiti into the United States. So in essence, and I know this is an ugly way to look at this issue, but in essence, they have relocated the plantations. That's what the US cotton farmers, in essence, that's what they have done.
I wanted to read a couple of comments that we have on Facebook. First, I believe that as Haitians, we need to start taking care of one another. We need to start valuing ourselves before we value foreigners. We need to stop destroying each other's businesses in order for our countries to move forward. And another comment that was placed was, what role can the people, the diasporas play in addressing some of these issues? A comment that's on the Zoom chat is the role of international community must be a role of focus around this area.
The Asian community is always self-criticizing each other on the issue of supporting each other. But at the same time, typically Asian communities are very strong anywhere they go as a strong community, and they manage to be represented at the political level. We are in Miami, we see that. Of course, it's extremely important, but there is only so much that can be done when there is so much power and influence being exercised against the general economic and financial system within Haiti. So, you can fight as much as you want, but at the end of the day, if you want to trade rice, you're not going to be able to. That applies to a lot of different activities and products. It can be cement. If you want to produce cement and distribute cement, you're not going to be able to because the business is completely run by outsiders, and there are political reasons why. So there is an issue of sovereignty, I think, ahead of being successful in supporting each other. Supporting each other it's mandatory, but unless the sovereignty issue is addressed, I think it will always be a challenge. On the issue of the diaspora, obviously the diaspora is supporting 25% of GDP in Haiti, which is more than $2 billion every year. So that's already a major investment and contribution that the diaspora is doing in Haiti. I think the diaspora should really focus on coalitions and lobby the US government in changing the policies that are affecting Haiti. This particular issue of the diaspora and lobby the US government and policies, I want to point out that the education system in Haiti is the highest privatized system in the world. And we know, everybody know that unless we have free access to education, Haiti will always struggle. So we have to invest in the access. So why the US has been not only not investing in free education, but creating solutions that are reinforcing the private education in Haiti. And how did they do that? For example, lots of money went to the education system through PSUGO, which was this effort of subsidizing education in Haiti, where $90 were given per each child per year to schools that qualified and children then qualified, but it maintained the state of privatization. So lots of money were deployed by the World Bank into this particular solution, which results are very questionable. But in essence, the main objective was to maintain the state of privatization in education. And it's not because they necessarily want to protect the businesses then, or the business owners that have opened schools. First of all, we go back to the social engineering and how the United States themselves are pushing towards the privatization of education. And so, you know, a place to them to see how it works in other countries. But also, they are fully aware that unless the access is universal, Haiti will continue to struggle. I hope that ecosystem where the diaspora and the organizations working in Haiti can have a coalition and voice together the concerns and use this strength and this power to vet all of the policies will be probably the best and the fastest way to push Haiti forward.
Does Haiti have a political structure issue, or would it be more of an infrastructure issue?
Both exist, but I think exist by design. Meaning, for example, right now we are all fully aware that Haiti is flooded with guns. This is just a reality. We know that the guns are not coming from Russia, are not coming from Iran, are not coming from China, are not coming from Venezuela, but are coming from the United States. So I believe that there is no chance that Haiti will be flooded with guns unless there was some sort of interest and knowledge of these guns entering Haiti. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because in the back, I think there are designs and there are policies and intentions then destabilize, truly destabilize the political system. And destabilize the political system means that whoever gets to run the country must be friendly to the foreign policy of the US, Canada, European Union, France. It doesn't matter how much we point the finger to local politicians if truly they are not in power, because that's my impression, that unfortunately there are other forces that are destabilizing the country. Have to come to terms with a lot of pressure from the outside. So the stakeholders are not the Asian people, because if the stakeholder were the Asian people, we would not have riots going on for 2 years to this extent. So obviously there is a broken link. There is in terms of democratic contest, there is a broken link which is given by the fact that the stakeholders are not the locals, are not the Asians, are not the citizens, but are other forces. And the politicians are coming to terms with these other forces. And they will always leverage for themselves. I want to point out that in Haiti, we have infrastructure that is working for American businesses. If they are able to pull out of Haiti $1.1 billion worth of garments, means that there is infrastructure that it's working. It just happened that it's working for them. And they are not willing to go the same length that they are willing to go for their own business for the population. So in other words, if they really wanted, it was going to be possible. There is not a natural reason, or there is not an innate reason why Haiti cannot have the infrastructure that is needed. In my view, this child is really the collateral damage. And that is why I don't like the word slavery. I don't like the word slaves, because the risk is that we only look at the dynamic of abuser and victim, and we think that is a Haitian problem. When in reality, I think this child is just in that position to survive, and survive out of this very complex set of problems and policies that are generating the extreme poverty. In absence of the extreme poverty, I think parents will not send their children in domestic servitude. In absence of extreme poverty and poverty, the families will not probably have the degree of stress and problems and concerns that are degenerating into that type of abuse and into that type of exploitation. So I think there's a whole chain that once it's addressed, then it's easier to have interventions with the hope that one day is going to come to a stop and there is no need to address domestic servitude. Otherwise, we will continue to spin our wheels and never really get to the bottom of domestic servitude.
It's clear that you have a much more systemic approach. She's coming in from a psychologist perspective, but trying to get a sense of the work that you do, since it clearly is much more systemic. Like, what's the approach that you're using? What's your framework?
I am 100% aligned with Sophony last week description of the mental health angle, 100%. The only element that I wanted to add tonight was that the people of the household, being the adults or sometimes the abusers, they also need mental health interventions. And I have seen this times that I was inside the house because the child had visible signs of abuse while they were at the school. And I decided to walk home with them. And the adult felt a little bit of pressure being there with the child. And out of a moment of nervousness, she decided to show me how she beat the child. And when she proceeded to go through the process, I saw that the woman was shaking and she was going through a crisis. And so that became obvious to me that, there is more to it. We are concerned about the child, obviously, and we are working with the children. But for somebody that is in interventions from the point of view of psychology, I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done also with the adults that are involved in this dynamic. So I speak about the systemic issues and I look at the geopolitical context, but in reality, as an organization, we do not interfere, we do not work anyhow on a political level in the US or in Haiti, and definitely not in Haiti. I will feel much more comfortable to address this issue on a political level in the US, but not in Haiti. I have tried to bring the issue of domestic servitude to some politicians, but it did not really work out. And I think it will not be our place as an organization working in Haiti. So our work has been confined to facilitate their access to education. And basically, we found some community schools that originally were free or charging very little tuitions, and they had a large percentage of student population that was Restavek, and we wanted to support them. For a child that goes through years of domestic servitude, in my opinion, it's a life sentence, because we have worked also with adults that went through domestic servitude, women, and it's very difficult to overcome. Interpersonal relationships, in how successful they are economically, the fact that most times they are illiterate. So there are a lot of consequences that are marking these lives forever. I do believe that mental health is a major part of it, and some of you have pointed out how is affecting education. And indeed, we worked for all of these years trying to keep them inside the classroom, but it's not working because the classrooms are not designed around the issues of this child. Many classrooms have corporal punishment. Many classrooms have punishment embedded in the pedagogy, So it doesn't work for this child. And as you know, classrooms have too many kids, and it's impossible for teachers to dedicate the appropriate amount of time and effort and attention to this child. And as you have pointed out, when this child is in the classroom, many times is in a safe space, and it's unable really to focus on what is being on the work that is being done in the classroom, because they are processing everything that is happening to them outside of the classroom. So we have tried to mitigate with domestic servitude, but I think it's not the appropriate way to work. And we want to build a residential school that will give the opportunity to this child to step out of exploitation for food and shelter and have a facility that I know many people do not like facilities and institutions. And I grew up in one, so I can somehow agree with that. But for this child, the reality is that unless there is appropriate mental health, unless there is education that is designed, pedagogy that is designed for them, and unless there is a program that is enabling them to pursue an income, they will not overcome extreme poverty. So if we want for them to overcome extreme poverty, our solution is basically a boarding school as you find in Switzerland for the global elite. That's what I want to see for Restavek children. And that's where we are heading. But we are coming from paying the tuitions. We are coming from giving bonuses to teachers, facilitating training through the CHAMP. The CHAMP has a lot of training courses in Port-au-Prince. So we take the teachers to these courses. A book bank, we distribute textbooks, free textbooks to all of the kids, all of the teachers, the entire school. Then we have some other interventions that can be vaccinations, shoes, food, uniforms, but chiefly is access to education. But what we really want at this point is a facility that it's enabling them to overcome extreme poverty. And we do not want to mitigate anymore with all the limitations that are disabling this child from being successful. So they are happy to receive the textbooks because a lot of the kids do not have textbooks. They are happy with some of the attention that, inevitably they receive from us, but those are not effectively moving them out of domestic servitude or extreme poverty. And I can no longer really mitigate this and say that everything is fine and we are receiving all the textbooks back and the textbooks are lasting many years. All of this is true, but it's not leading this child to be successful.
I definitely want to thank you again for coming to have this. Yeah, merci en pile. And like we mentioned last week, with this type of topic, this is definitely a human rights issue. And we definitely, everybody plays a role in trying to help regulate the situation. You see something, you say something. You always have to, don't just let it happen. Alex brought up a lot of points this evening. And Alex, do you have any last remarks before I close it?
All of the last points that Sophony made are the points that have suggested to me that paying tuition by itself is not effective. And unless you are able to empower the school and address all of the issues that are inside the school, which is very difficult, then you are going through a motion, but you are not really getting the academic success that you want, or you are not really getting the type of outcome that you are seeking. So the model of paying tuition by itself, it's very poor. I know that it's very popular, and we ask money for sponsorship for a child tuition, but I think for this child in these schools is not enough. So I'm 100% in agreement with Sophie.
All right, thank you. And so as we say goodnight to all our Facebook people, again, my name is Natasha Janak. I am the chairwoman of Liberté Santé Mentale, and this was another segment of Décharger l'Esprit, where we talk about a whole lot of topics, and we are live every Thursday at 7:30, and you can check us out on Liberté Santé Mentale Facebook page and Liberté Santé Mentale IG page, and on our website at www.libertésantémentale. Till next week. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.